Sziasztok!
So it's the hellos pouring in.
Okay. Köszöntök mindenkit. Hello everybody, welcome. I'll speak in both languages now. Mind a két nyelven fogok beszélni egy darabig. Dear participants, welcome at the first edition of a series of lectures entitled The Practice of Theory, the Theory of Practice, organized by the Performance Studies Committee of the CUB, Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Let me introduce ourselves. Ungvári Zrínyi Ildikó. I'm the president, Lázok János, the secretary of the committee, Patko Éva, a colleague of ours in the committee, and secretary of CUB, Boldizsák Zsuzsa, who helped us with organizing this event. Technical manager Tóth István. Kedves hallgatóság, üdvözlöm Önöket az elmélet gyakorlat elmélete rendezvénysorozaton, amelyet a CUB Színháztudományi Bizottsága szervezett, a CUB MTA szervezett Színháztudományi Bizottsága, szakbizottsága. Hadd mutassam be önmagunkat. Ungvári Zrínyi Ildikó elnök, Lázok János titkár, Tóth István technikai szervező, Patko Éva és Boldizsák Zsuzsa, akik a szervezésben segítettek. Our guests these 2 days are two outstanding researchers and theater makers, Duska, Radosavljevic and Christopher Balme, and a series of lectures will problematize the changing role of theater makers and theorists these days, how to adapt educational strategies to the new needs in the formation of actors, directors, dramaturgs, playwrights, and so on. They will speak about changing market, teaching methods, and the work during the pandemic. So all these are very, very sharp in these days. Tehát a mi mai két napig vendégeink lesznek Duska Radosavljevic és Christopher Balme, két kiemelkedő kutató, és a rendezvénysorozat a színházcsinálók, illetve elméleti szakértők változó szerepeiről fog szólni, hogyan kellene a pedagógiai stratégiákat alkalmazni a szakemberek képzéséhez, a változó munkaerőpiacról a színházban, a különböző oktatási módszerek változásáról, és arról is, hogy ezek hogyan fognak alkalmazkodni a pandémia időszakához. First, our MVT is Duska Radosavljevic, and I'm really honored she accepted our invitation. Duska Radosavljevic is a writer, dramaturg, and academic, the author of a very well-known and award-winning book entitled Theater Making, Interplay Between Text and Performance in the 21st Century. She is the editor of the Contemporary Ensemble and Theater Criticism Changing Landscape. One of her very important and far-reaching recent texts is The Heterarchical Director, a model of authorship for the 21st century, which is not so easy to read in our region, because it is very difficult to obtain a copy of this book. She writes regularly for the Stage and Exeunt and is a regional editor of the Theatre Times. Her research interests are in theater authorship, writing, directing, and devising, theater criticism in the digital age, oral and oral dramaturgies. And she will speak about her recent research interests at the end of the presentation. As a dramaturg, because she's a theater maker, practitioner, she has worked for various theater companies in England. She is reader in contemporary theatre and performance at the Royal Centre School of Speech and Drama, University of London. And she delivered very many courses in England and abroad, everywhere, in Kolozsvár too. So after I presented her, I tell a few words about Duska Radosavljevic in Hungarian too. Tehát Duska Radosavljevic dramaturg, egyetemi ember, író, tehát akadémik, és igen, és a Theater Making című könyvnek a szerzője, ez egy igen jól ismert könyv a szakirodalomban. Legutóbbi nagy horderejű szövege a heterarchikus rendező. Tehát, hogy a szerzőség modelljeivel foglalkozik, és ebben a szövegében is azt teszi. Gyakorló dramaturgként több angliai társulattal dolgozott, és hát a kutatási területei az a színházi szerzőség, az írásrendezés és a devised theater, és ez a kritikaírás a digitális korban, valamint az aurális és orális dramaturgiák. És miután bemutattam, azt hiszem, hogy áttérhetünk az előadásra. So I will kindly ask everybody to mute the microphones, and if you want to pass to the translation, to switch to translation, then click on the planet and click on German, and there you'll find the Hungarian translation. Now let me invite you to deliver your lecture, Duska. And I think I told everything that was important. Tehát átadom a szót Duska Radosavljevicsnek, tartsa meg az előadását.
Thank you very much, Ildikó. Thank you, everyone. And I'm really honored also to be here today talking to you about this project. It is the first time I am actually talking about the new research project I'm working on. And this presentation is really a way of finding a bridge between the previous research that I presented in the book Theater Making, which you mentioned, and what will hopefully become a new book on oral and oral dramaturgies that I'm working on at the moment. And the reason why I've called this paper Diversifying Research Methodologies is because I have found that in focusing on work that uses speech and sound as its departure point, so oral dramaturgies is really about a body of work I have identified that starts and begins with speech and sound rather than the written text. I found that in trying to theorize work of that kind, it seemed necessary to rethink what research methodologies might be the most appropriate research methodologies for engaging with work that is not written. My desire was to sort of depart from, some of the research methodologies we have inherited through writing and through prioritizing the written text. So I would like to begin this presentation today by just, first of all, summarizing some of the key aspects of what I think was my methodology in theater making, and what the key aspects of that work kind of left behind, so that I can bridge over to this new work that I'm introducing to you today. One of the key aspects of theater making as a book, as an academic book, was this idea of, let's say, deprofessionalization. I didn't use the term deprofessionalization in the book. I used the term multi-professionalization because I was referring to a new a professional profile that was emerging in the British theatre that we called theatre maker. And actually this choice of terms was influenced by the theatre critic Lynn Gardiner, who in one of the interviews I made with her talked to me about this distinction between, actors, on the one hand, actors, directors, playwrights who were trained in drama schools to enter the theatre working place, the repertory theatres, as ready-made personnel, and they usually trained in drama schools. And on the other hand, we had theatre makers, people who were graduating from theatre departments or drama or performance studies departments from universities. And in universities, these students were trained in a multidisciplinary way. They were not trained to be actors, directors, or playwrights or designers, but they were given opportunities to create practice and develop a way of working that was not that would not fit within those pre-existing categories. A collaborative way of working was being encouraged, and therefore a lot of theatre makers emerged from university drama departments as people who worked in companies. So here I'm thinking of people like Forced Entertainment, who are probably the most famous in Europe as an example of this way of working, but there are many others, Frantic Assembly, Knee-High Theatre, in some other ways also people like Theatre de Complicité and companies that came out of the Lecoq theatre tradition, who trained in France, however, but they also were promoting this collaborative ensemble way of working and so on. So then I would like to begin by thinking about this notion of deprofessionalization, and one way in which we can perceive deprofessionalization specifically in the in this theatre context is as a positive result of this training structure that has emerged in the British-speaking world, and it's we can see it as having given opportunities to people to enter the workplace differently and to create work and receive funding to create work in the British system, as people who worked in companies rather than who had to seek employment in theatres. However, it is also dialectically possible to see this as a problematic outcome of the free market economy. It is possible to see it as a long-term consequence of Thatcherism in Britain and the way in which the idea of a repertory, the idea of an ensemble theatre, the way we know it in Central Europe, for example, has ceased to exist in the UK in the 1980s. At that point, it was seen unviable to have actors employed in theatres on permanent contracts, and there were no longer any ensemble theatres in British theatres from the 1980s onwards. So we could read this trend as being a kind of manifestation of neoliberal capitalism, and we could see it therefore as being problematic in that way and something that we should critique. What I'd like to maintain here is a kind of a dialectical approach where we somehow try and account for and hold both possibilities at the same time, that something can be seen as both problematic and negative, but also potentially emancipatory and positive, you know, and something that forces us to adapt and to innovate and to accept innovation in different ways. I will not go into detail here around some of the thinking. There is quite a bit of thinking in sociology around deprofessionalization and how, for example, this notion of deprofessionalization in some circles has led towards disempowerment of certain professional classes. So, for example, how teachers or doctors or postal workers have in the recent decades lost their sense of professionality at work because of the advent of the bureaucratic layer of professional staff that has come into organizations in order to improve efficiency and so on and so forth. And there are historical reasons for how this has come about and why. Maybe one thing that would be useful to note is the way in which, however, we must understand these effects of deprofessionalization as being very much contingent on their specific cultural contexts. So when we speak about deprofessionalization in this way in the British theatre, it would be very different from how it might function or how it might exist or not exist in other cultural contexts. I'm not saying that deprofessionalization is positive per se. It is complicated. It very much depends on how it happens within its own cultural context. So it is very fortunate for British theatre makers that the British funding system for the arts is constructed in such a way that it does not favor institutions, it favors individual artists just as much as particular theaters. So there are avenues for funding for individual artists and individual companies that are available to them. Not all of the money goes to theaters directly. And so in that respect, deprofessionalization is not as much a problem in the UK as it might be in some other contexts whose funding processes are different. However, when we think about this in relation to theory and in relation to scholarly work that we are doing, I guess one of the factors that is quite important in considering research methodologies and how they may or may not be diversified appropriately is basically the structures we have received, the kind of epistemological and knowledge producing structures that we use in academia, in academic circles. And in this respect, it is probably important to note the way in which probably since the late 19th century, we have, the 19th century seems an important moment for me in my work because I constantly go back to this idea of how what theatre makers now are doing is dismantling the structures of the 19th century in this long view way. So, we are this notion of even the division of labor that we have in theatre, where we talk about actors, directors, playwrights, and so on, and scenographers, is something that became formalized in that way in the 19th century. But also in academia, certain knowledge producing mechanisms became formalized at that moment in time. And what has been particularly dominant throughout the 20th century in terms of epistemology, in terms of knowledge producing, has been the idea of critique, which we have inherited from Kant and then Marx and then the Frankfurt School. And in our field, the field of theater and performance studies, the notion of critique and critical theory has, for very good reasons, been the dominant mode of thinking about theater and theater production. A lot of scholars see it as their main task to sort of read a piece of work, whether it's a piece of literature or a piece of theater or a piece of visual arts, in relation to how it manifests the hidden workings of ideology or certain hegemonies that might be at play. So this is the conventional fail-safe a mode of critical theory to debunk the hidden workings of ideology and hegemonies. In this respect, however, critique has also led to a kind of reflex way of working in our field. It has favored a particular way of approaching theater and performance that, in my view, is not always sufficient. So when I worked on theater making, here's the book, Theater Making, this was actually part of a research project that entailed, it had a companion book. The companion book was the Contemporary Ensemble that Ildiko mentioned earlier, where I interviewed a number of artists who worked as ensemble makers, and I used those testimonies and sort of teased out some findings by talking to various people in various contexts who favored the ensemble way of working, to try to understand specifically how working in an ensemble has changed the dramaturgical practices. So how it has changed this relationship between text and performance that might have existed in the 19th century model of theater making. And some of what became my research methodology in theater making, in explicit terms, I could talk about how I use the method of interview, the method of literature review, the method of critical reflection, all of these sort of conventional tools that we have in our field. But actually, I think there was a number of other things that were at play that formed part of my methodology that were also quite significant to note. And I tried in this paper today to kind of summarize some of those methodological features that I have kind of, that emerged out of this work on theater making, and that I'm trying to build on as a result of, as part of this new project I'm working on. So one of the important aspects I've identified looking back on this work is that what I was quite interested in, and what actually I brought to this methodology simply by being someone who exists or who lives between two cultural contexts. So on the one hand, I am, well, in fact, I come from Serbia originally, but I lived all of my adult life in the UK. However, I have this sort of bicultural and bilingual approach to thinking about the phenomena and the actual ways of working in theater. And what's at play for me, methodologically speaking, is a certain kind of code switching, almost quasi-ethnographic approach, where I'm constantly switching between the roles of an insider and outsider. And I'm trying to observe and understand how theatre is made in the UK by constant reference to how I know it to be being made elsewhere. So, for example, in this respect, one of the things that interested me in theatre making was to think about this notion of devising. And what does devising mean in the UK? And how it is different or similar to the idea of improvisation in, let's say, Stanislavskian tradition of theatre making. And there are some similarities and there are some differences. And then there are very specific ways in which devising has emerged out of the UK context. But the tendency has sometimes been to kind of mystify it as some special way of working that, you know, we all need to learn. But actually, the reality is that, you know, devising is not that different from improvisation. It's just that it kind of had a slightly different way of developing politically and historically in a particular context, and it acquired a different term. So this re-examination of the vocabulary became very important to me in my methodology, and this sort of historiographic re-examination of particular phenomena became important to me. Another important thing for me was to try and make a kind of argument in this work in favor of the notion of translation as an act of transformation. So it's not enough to just translate things from one language to another in the hope that there are direct semantic equivalents. It is necessary to understand the word fully in its original context, and try and understand the underlying meanings and translate those underlying meanings into another context, even if this requires a certain transformation, even if we reach for a completely different word in a different language to try and get this sort of meaning across. So this may, to a lot of us here today, seem commonsensical, because for those of us who work with different languages, who do have a certain bilingualism as part of our daily life, this is totally understandable. But actually, for a lot of British people who only work with the English language as the only language, without a reference to other possibilities, it seems important to me to highlight the fact that you know, there are other meanings available or other ways in which something might translate, which depends on the context of the target of that translation. So that sort of bicultural, bilingual, quasi-ethnographic code switching is one aspect of my approach. Another aspect of my methodological approach might be this conviction for me that the artist is also a producer of knowledge. We tend to think of the academic as a producer of knowledge, but actually my work, all of my work, I want to underline the idea that the artist also produces knowledge, but that they might actually manifest this or express this in a different language, which is the language of artistic creation. And that the academic and the critic might just choose to critique the work of the artist by taking it out of context and kind of subjecting it to critique. But equally important, in my view, is also the idea that as an academic or a critic, we might try and understand what the artist is doing in terms of the language of artistic work, and when the artist reaches new knowledge through their practical and artistic work, that we might find an effective way of translating that into the language of academia. And in that respect, what is necessary is a certain collaboration between the artist and the academic. Again, maybe in the Hungarian context, this seems completely, and in the Romanian context, this might seem completely commonsensical. It might seem completely like, yes, this is, obvious. But in the British context, it isn't necessarily, because the gap between the artistic production and the knowledge production of universities has become so wide that there is sometimes not even any communication across the two. Thirdly, in my approach, in my methodology, I might want to underline the idea that it is important to understand an artist's work in relation to its trajectory of development. So rather than just taking a piece of work out of context, which often happens in academic work. So the work of critique is to take a piece of work and analyze it for its hidden meanings, but not always necessarily by reference to other works of that have preceded this work, in terms of either the creator, so like the rest of the artist's oeuvre that came before it, or any other works that might have influenced it or made that made this work possible in terms of its form or content or whatever. So, for example, in the book Theatre Making, in chapter 5, I talk about Tim Crouch's piece, The Author, which was quite a controversial piece of theatre for various reasons, and it wasn't immediately understood by critics and audiences when it was performed in 2009 in the Royal Court. Tim Crouch received terrible letters from audiences about how this work should not be allowed, how it was the waste of public money, and so on. And my argument in the book has been that really, in order to understand what Tim Crouch was doing in The Author, it would be beneficial. I can't really say it would be necessary, but if I could, I would say it would be necessary to understand how The Author came about in terms of the previous works that Tim Crouch had made, because there is a certain trajectory of development of a particular methodology of working that culminates with The Author itself. So I would advocate for a certain continuity of familiarity with an artist's work. It's not enough just to collaborate with an artist, in terms of putting across how their work reaches new knowledge, but also it seems important for a researcher to engage with an artist's work over a period of time. So in that respect, I would argue against this practice of ripping a piece of work out of the rest of the context of this artist's work and kind of analyzing it in isolation. But instead, the researcher's task should be to engage with the work on a continuous basis. And also in the process of interviewing the artist, I would argue for a certain improvisational approach. Very often what happens in academic interviews of artists is that an academic arrives to the interview with a pre-existing agenda of what they want to prove or what they want to demonstrate or what they want to find, and that may not always allow for insights to emerge naturally through kind of a real curiosity and deep understanding and genuine interest in the artist's work. On the other hand, it's also important to say that I'm certainly not advocating for fandom. It's not about, celebrating an artist's work because the academic or the researcher is a fan of the artist or the work, or because the celebrity factor of that work would then promote the research itself. I think that would be ethically problematic. The impulse to engage with an artist's work should really emerge out of a synergy between the interests of the artists themselves, and the researcher themselves, kind of investigating or exploring a similar research question. I was going to talk a bit today about the other terms that are relevant here, especially in relation to my work on oral and aural dramaturgies of speech and sound, and in relation to this current moment. What I mean by aural and oral dramaturgies, or dramaturgies of speech and sound, is a certain body of work which has, over the last 20 years, favored speech, for example, verbatim theater, or sound, for example, immersive headphones theater. And the reason I bring them together is because both of these practices, and actually I see them as three, because I also account for what is known as gig theatre in the UK. And gig theatre is a form of theatre that actually looks like a music gig. And sometimes it can begin with a play being written by a playwright, but very often it begins with this idea of needing to be kind of like a piece of music theater. I wouldn't say it's a musical. I wouldn't say gig theater is necessarily a musical. It certainly doesn't exist in that framework of the West End musical. It comes more from a sort of DIY punk and rock and roll iconography. And it's not necessarily just British. I mean, for example, we can see it in the work of Lola Arias, Argentinian theater maker who is very active in Germany at the moment, or the Greek theater maker Aris Biniaris has also reinvented classical Greek drama through putting in a bit of rock and roll into his productions. So I'm interested in how this paradigmatic move towards theater that favors speech and sound, and is not so much interested in the play text as a starting point, has emerged, where it comes from, why is it so prevalent. And I'm using the terms immersive, participation, and relational. And these were the terms that I was sort of using in the 5th chapter of theater making. So it's in a way, again, I'm bridging between theater making and this new interest, trying to understand how this theater of speech and sound is in some ways what we might call immersive theater as well. The problem with the terminology immersive in particular is that the term immersive has become problematic because, especially in the work of certain really esteemed academics, it has been associated, these practices have become associated with neoliberal capitalism. So Adam Alston has done really important work in showing how immersive theater can be seen as having been co-opted by neoliberal capitalism. And similarly, even the term participation is probably one of the most positive ones of these terms that could be attached to these forms of theater that involve the audience differently in the process of watching theater, experiencing theater. But almost all of these existing terms have been shown to have been problematic for some reason, or the practices associated with these terms are problematic. Another term is relational. And here I was particularly interested in the work of the Slovenian scholar Bojana Kunst, who has written in her book Artist at Work about, in amongst other things, this is very much a reading of some contemporary performance practices and the works of artists working in theatre and performance, um, from this sort of political perspective of how they form immaterial labor. So she applies the theoretical apparatus drawn from people like Paolo Verno and other sort of critics of the neoliberal capitalism in analyzing the work of artists. And I was particularly interested in a bit where she talks about relationality and critiques relationality as something that is really just interested in the production of sociality, and that it is also something that is audience member, that very often the audience member is seen as an unpaid performer in some of these works. And I don't wish to argue against Kunst's argument itself or against Alston's argument. I think those arguments and upholdable, but in terms of what I've just outlined, in terms of my methodological interests and my interests in theory, I would be inclined to seek an alternative approach for reading these particular phenomena in contemporary theatre and performance. And this work began for me in theatre making. In the final chapter, I called the final chapter relational new works. I chose the term relational specifically. I did not want to choose at that point the term immersive. I was interested at the time in how these relational new works were also about building communities. And I guess I'm also interested in continuing this bias towards seeing relational new works as community building and as having specific affordances that may not have been seen up until now, and that are worth highlighting. So I guess one thing that I found interesting in Kunst's, and something that really clarified and crystallized for me what my methodology is this notion where she talked about collaboration as potentially also being a problematic, that we can understand collaboration as meaning, especially in terms of politics, as being connected to treason. And this reminded me of how in our shared former country, Yugoslavia, we had the term collaborationist for the Nazi collaborator after the Second World War, and how what I would like to do is restore a positive meaning of collaboration with an artist, rather than necessarily implying that the artist is a collaborator with the enemy. I mean, this is a tricky this is a big question. I really don't wish to go into that territory. It's not at all about re-examining that whole moment of history, but it really is just about language and how we use terms and how we rehabilitate certain terms. So in terms of my new developing research methodology, I'm really interested in the notion of relational ontologies. And I am specifically for today, I have chosen to highlight two texts, two thinkers. One thinker is Italian philosopher Adriana Cavarero, who has written a book, well, she has written many books, but the one that I found very useful here is a book called For More Than One Voice, in which she makes an argument for an anti-Platonic, anti-metaphysical, embodied relational ontology of plural uniqueness, by trying to reconceive voice as something that has been left out of the entire history of Western metaphysics, because the Western metaphysics has been particularly interested in what can be seen rather than what can be heard, and how it has privileged ways of understanding speech as something that has to be logocentric rather than something that has to be sonic in nature, and so on and so forth. Cavarero's theorizing is also useful because it has a political focus. It is interested in politicization of this new kind of relational ontology. It is not about devalorizing the work, the political work of critique at all. So in this respect, Cavarero is really important to me. And another important idea comes from an anthropologist of sound, Stephen Feld, who has coined the term acoustemology, in which he, this arises out of his ethnographic work that he conducted in the 1990s in the Busavi rainforest of Papua New Guinea, where he lived with people called the Kaluli. And he lived with them for 25 years, studying them, immersing himself in their culture, in their worldview, and in their conception of listening. And he found that the Kaluli people had a certain epistemology that was different from a Western epistemology, which emphasized the notion of listening. And they were very much interested in the song of birds, and the song of birds had very specific layers of meaning for them. The flights of birds formed part of this acoustemology, of this epistemology as well. It is a kind of immersive epistemology that requires one to kind of drop what one knows about the Western ways of knowing in order to kind of assume a completely different paradigm of understanding and seeing the world. And this notion of acoustemology has been adopted by Western, various kinds of Western academics and researchers in various fields. So there has been studies of incarceration, historical studies, for example, of the early modern England in terms of sound, understanding what that part of history might have been like by reference to how it sounded. Or it has been applied to the study of hospitals, a sociological study of hospitals, for example. And also there have been moves to extend the notion of acoustemology towards the non-hearing subjects, non-hearing areas. So acoustemology does not have to be sonocentric, it can actually accommodate disability as well. So in a way, it is not an exclusive methodology. At this point, I will just show you very quickly what I have been working on. Am I okay for time? Am I? Yeah, okay. So at this point, I'm just going to share my screen. We are just launching this website. This is probably one of the first times you get an opportunity to see, for anyone getting an opportunity. We haven't launched it on social media yet. It is basically the outcome of our work. I say our. I'm working with a team of people. My research associate, Flora Pitrolo, who has been with me from the beginning of this project. The project began in January this year. It was conceived in partnership with 3 organizations. One was Digital Theatre Plus. One was a theatre in London called Battersea Arts Centre, and one was the Victoria and Albert Museum. And the project is funded by the AHRC, and we planned to work with a selection of artists on studying how they work. We selected these artists through an open call within the remit of the project. All of them are artists who work with speech and sound as the primary compositional means in making performance. And we planned to also make a podcast with Digital Theatre Plus, which was going to be a 12-part podcast that we were going to launch at the end of the project. But because of COVID, we were going to work with Tim Bano, who is a podcast producer for this. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, all of our project has been redesigned. We were no longer able to go into rehearsals with the artists. We began a process of sort of expanding the podcast idea, and then deciding to build the website, which we were not going to do. We did not intend to build this website at all. So we've ended up with the website as a place where we keep all of the recorded materials we have collected, and we have called it Lend Me Your Ears. It's a quote from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Lend Me Your Ears. So there are Lend Me Your Ears is a collection. It will be a collection of materials we have collected. And there are two ways of navigating through it, by issue and by category. There are 4 categories currently. There will be 5, but currently we have 4. Interviews with artists, conversations about sound, creative practices, and oral introductions to books. And so these first 2, interviews with artists and conversations about sound, are just sound only podcast type of resources. And these 2 are Zoom generated videos where we have asked artists to tell us about a particular production they have made using speech or sound as the primary area of interest. And in the library, we have asked academics to tell us about their books in short 20-minute interviews. And there will be 5 chapters, 5 issues, actually. The first issue is the one we are launching right now. And the following issues mirror the structure of my book, hopefully, which will be written hopefully one day next year. There are 5 chapters. So the first one is introductions, and here we have released these artwork. Well, these recordings we have made with various artists and academics and thinkers and people in between. So you will be able to browse this in your own time, but I just wanted to illustrate, this is completely open access, so anyone can access it. I wanted to illustrate, you know, what it is that we have been doing, we have been focusing on. And this is one of the companies we focused on, called Sleepwalk Collective. And you can access you can download the full episode, or you can download the full transcript of this presentation. And you can also access, you know, or scroll through the recording, depending on where you want to access this material, you know, what you're interested in, and so on. You can obviously watch the whole thing as well. It has been an improvisation, this process of making this work, conducting this research. We were limited in terms of time. We had to conduct the project within an allocated period of time. We had to spend the money we have been given on you know, on this research, and so we simply had to reinvent the design of what this project became in the end. What else is important to say about this? Maybe the way in which I mean, if you have any questions about this later, you can ask me about this. But you know, I try and kind of explain. I try in my paper that I wrote to describe how we got to this point, which may not be necessarily important right now. Or maybe the final thing. Actually, maybe the final thing I can show you is really just some final, I have 11 points to summarize what I think is now my methodology after having conducted this bit of research this year, and what I'm moving towards in terms of promoting this new methodology, this sort of process of diversifying methodologies through something I have called post-critical artist-centered research methodology, which might be summarized as follows. So number one would be insights and arguments reached through relational ontologies and relational epistemologies demonstrate that both being and knowledge are contingent on a number of factors, some of which have historically lain outside of the domain legitimated and promoted by the Western tradition, canon, and establishment. Secondly, maybe we can say that having emerged in the 20th century, our field, the field of theater and performance, has inherited and adapted research methodologies from other fields, and that therefore the prevailing valorization of critique as a method has led to an occlusion of the creative agency of the artist, and resulting disenfranchisement of the theater artist from the formal epistemological structures of the academy. Thirdly, this post-critical artist-centered research methodology assumes the artist as a potential producer of knowledge, as I have said earlier, and a potential collaborator. This methodology recognizes that the artist and the academic use different processes, different languages, and different protocols to convey and communicate their knowledge to the world. However, this methodology is also not an acritical or not anti-critical. It is not apolitical or anti-political, and it is not a form of fandom. Not all artists are necessarily producers of new knowledge through their work. Whether or not a work has epistemological value is also not related to its artistic value. So this is important to distinguish. We are not saying all artists are producers of knowledge. And perception of epistemological value of an artist's work could be entirely dependent on the perspective of the researcher. So it's like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, you know, epistemological value is in the eye of the beholder. So here I outline also what I said earlier about the protocol of this kind of research, where you know, I still advocate for continued familiarity with the work of the artist, this co-articulating, the importance of co-articulating the specificities of the artist's idiom as part of this research, and mapping potential trajectories towards a relevant creative methodology or innovation that the researcher perceives as contribution to knowledge. And that this should emerge through a conversation that does not have a pre-existing thesis or critical agenda, but as a deep listening and genuine interest and improvisation at its core. Under 8, I would say this is the process of translation is key in this and translating these epistemological insights from the art making domain to the academic domain, and that is the job of the researcher. And the form and medium of academic output can be re-envisaged in relation to the specific needs of the research itself. So here I ask the question, are the epistemological achievements of speech and sound-based creative work, for example, more appropriately communicated through speech and sound-based academic artifacts rather than books or articles or written outputs? The form and medium of academic output can also be re-envisaged by reference to the technological developments, as writing itself is just a technology that is now being replaced by other digital technologies. So I would be really curious to see how we might reinvent academic outputs with reference to the digital developments. And finally, a post-critical artist-centered researcher should be free to improvise around and beyond these principles that I have noted here. This is not prescriptive. It is simply a summary of my approach. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much for this very rich in information lecture, and would like to ask your audience whether they have questions or not. And I'll ask everybody to show their faces for this time, because otherwise we can't talk, I think so. We cannot ask each other. I have a question while the others are thinking, because I can't see anybody raising hands. I have a question. How do you know, you talked about a gap, the gap between production and university, the academic world. And how did you realize what do the different parts do in order to close the gap or in order to be more interactive, to reach each other? So as institutions, because I realize that all your methods are developed in order to do this work. But as institutions, as structured institutions, what do they do?
So this is a very interesting question, and one that hasn't really been, this insight hasn't been articulated enough. I don't feel it hasn't been discussed enough in the British context. But actually, and I did have at the beginning of my written paper for today, I had a little bit about the work that was done by Simon Shepherd, a British scholar, on how the British system particularly is very different from anywhere else in the sense of it being really late and resistant towards the idea of Taylorism. You know, this American text that came out at the beginning of the 20th century, which was called The Principles of Scientific Management. It was a text from 1911 by S.W. Taylor, who was a US kind of theorist of production, industrial production. And this was a text that was quite significant in producing the managerial class in the American system. This idea of managers who then became educated through university degrees to do their job. So in a way, in the American system, but also in the German system, because the Germans did adopt Taylorism as well, there is this sort of this function of university, the function of the university education has been in the first half of the 20th century to aid the production of the middle classes, of the managerial classes, who would then ensure that the work was being done. Somehow this idea didn't really take root in the UK. And related to this is Simon Shepherd talking about, I'm trying to see if I have the book to show you, this book called Direction. It is here, I do recommend it. He talks about how in Britain, the idea of a theatre director did not really develop in the same way as it did in these other contexts. And in the British system, there isn't really training for directors. It hasn't really been developed historically as well as it has been in Central Europe or even in America. And the reason is because in the British context, the idea of a director, a theatre director, is somebody who comes, there are two routes. One route is somebody who comes from Oxford or Cambridge, and they usually will have studied English or English literature or history or something else in Oxford or Cambridge, because they don't study theatre or drama there at all. And so this would be like a gentleman director, the idea of a gentleman scholar. And the other profile has been someone who has been apprenticed as a stage manager to the theater, working as a stage manager, and then gradually learning the job of the theater director on the job and becoming a director. So these two profiles have emerged. And in this context, Shepherd also talks about how, in a way, there has never really been a direct correlation in the British system between, what universities for and what what the production processes need, what the marketplace needs, what the practice needs. This was never part of the thinking. People did university degrees because it was an indication of class belonging, or because they were curious for knowledge, or because they were capable, but not because they historically saw their degrees as a way of getting particular jobs or being able to do particular jobs in the British system. So there's always been a disconnect historically in some way. But additionally, I think the disconnect, and this is really interesting because partly it's also because I am someone who has worked both in theatre and in academia here in the UK. So my journey has been very unusual. And I found it very puzzling and confusing that I was experiencing this disconnect between the two. In a way, there is a mistrust as well. People of the theatre don't really trust academics. They think that, academics are complicating things too much, and they don't really know what they're talking about. It's all just theory, and it's all just, not really useful to us. I mean, I have actually heard this, very explicitly said to me when I've asked people who work in theatre in Britain. I've asked them, what sort of research would be useful to you coming from theatre or drama or performance studies departments? And they said to me, nothing is useful to me. No research is useful to me coming from those fields. You know, maybe I'm more interested in science or in history, but I'm not interested in research coming from theater and performance studies. On the other hand, also academics have, potentially partly because of this emphasis on the critique and the work of the critique, been focused on how you get original insights about something, how you become the first to read something in some particular way. And so the aim of the academic work became disengaged from understanding the processes of making that work. Because of the emphasis of the critique, the work of the academic became focused on hermeneutic processes of, simply interpreting the text or interpreting a work of art, rather than, and also partly because of Barthes and the Barthesian denunciation of the author. The death of the author in 1968 was a significant moment, which said we don't need to understand who the author is, what they do, how they've come to doing what they do, because we are not interested in that. We are just interested in what the text has to say on its own terms. So in that respect, the artist became uninteresting to an academic. So it's a number of different processes that were at play that led to this gap. And how it came for me was that as I said earlier, I worked in both fields, and I was trying to kind of straddle the gap in my own practice. I mean, my very first job was in Newcastle. I was employed to be the dramaturg in the Theatre Northern Stage, which was a theatre that happened to be on the university campus. And at the same time, the other half of my job was to work in the university and teach, drama related modules. But I was the only one. I was the only person who was being that bridge. Nobody else was interested in that bridging over. And so I wanted to understand why, and I wanted to kind of facilitate this exchange really from that beginning. Then I have moved on and done other things and sort of moved in between in different ways, but it seemed to make sense to me to try and kind of utilize this professional experience as a departure point for my research as well.
Thank you. Okay, more questions? Yes, Marto Norshoya, please unmute your microphone. Yes.
So I have a question in addition to one of your notes where you said that this methodology that you are working on is not apolitical, not anti-political. And I'm just asking, do you think for an artist is a requirement to be politically correct?
Oh, okay. So that's a completely different. Sort of question. Yes, very good question. Thank you. But it wasn't. I didn't expect it. Is it important for an artist to be? No, I don't think it's important for an artist to be politically correct. I think that, the notion of political correctness is tied in with other sorts of processes and questions. And I think the notion of political correctness is really to do with how we in the public sphere interact with each other. So this should be to some extent a responsibility of all of us in terms of how we treat each other, how we talk to each other, and how we accommodate difference. Not as some sort of a fascist thing that that has to be enforced and that has to be imposed upon others. Not at all. It really is. I am aware of the way in which political correctness has been taken into extremes in some ways, but that's because that happens when the attempt is made to impose it on others. But I think political correctness is potentially useful. I say this as someone who comes from a place that was torn apart in a war, you know. So I believe that that may not have happened if the public discourse and in the public sphere was conducted with respect for the other, with respect for those that are different. So I think in that respect, I think the idea of political correctness is a good one. Only the question becomes, how does it get enforced? How does it get, or not enforced? It really shouldn't have to be enforced. It should have to be something that we all want to subscribe to, just out of respect for each other and each other's difference. But in terms of the artist and what the artist is obliged to have to, you know, how their politics play out, I think the work of an artist doesn't necessarily that doesn't necessarily have to conform to the expectations of political correctness. So the artist has to be free, and their work has to be free to say anything, as long as we understand that that is done under the remit of a work of art, under something that is circumscribed by its form as being, you know, a work of art. But then that is a different thing from who the artist is and what the artist says in the public domain. So the artist as a citizen, in my view, still has to have responsibility, political responsibility, as someone who is participating in the past. So one good example of this is, for example, the work of Oliver Frljić, the Croatian theater director, who, you know, whose work comes across as being extremely controversial, extremely provocative for people. And of course, this is deliberate. He does this in order to produce those reactions from the audience. But this doesn't mean that he, as an individual, an individual citizen, is someone who is irresponsible or someone who is, who just wants to cause trouble. When you actually talk to him, or when you listen to him speak about how he makes work and why he makes work in this particular way, there is always a very good rationale for choosing to present his work to an audience in this particular way. Because he believes that theater has to have this sort of political function. Another way of putting this is, and this is my last point and then I'm finished, is that when I was writing about some of these works in theater making, like the piece called Internal, made by the Belgian company Ontroer and Good, this was a very controversial piece of theater that a lot of people had ethical issues with, because it was a piece that manipulated the audience into a kind of a date situation. And some people like Adam Alston, that I mentioned earlier, have in a way condemned, that's a strong word, but you know, he has criticized this piece of work as being ethically problematic. When I was writing about it, I acknowledged the importance to consider the ethical dimension in relation to works like these ones, but I stated that my interest was not so much in the ethics of this work, but in how this work was made and in how innovative it was in terms of its dramaturgy and where its dramaturgy came from. And additionally, I then resorted to an argument made by Nick Rideout in a little book called Theatre and Ethics, where he says that for a piece of work to be ethical, it is enough for it to just raise ethical questions. So that's a different thing from the artist being ethical. I think all of us as artists and academics and members of society need to be ethical. But a piece of theater work doesn't have to be promoting our ethics. It can be asking questions. It can be confronting people. It can be provocative to be ethical. That's the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Some other questions? Yeah, Albert, Maria.
Thank you for your presentation. It has come to a very interesting outcome, because I'm very much interested in the sound part of theater creation. And I wanted to ask two things stroke a chord with me in this respect. How some immersive productions, I don't remember the exact phrase you used, but maybe something like co-opted immersive theater as one of their tactics. And then the other thing was this importance of the oral transmission of knowledge in the educational process. I have a radio show about education besides working at the university, so this is very interesting for me. So I would like you to refer to this. And there was one performance that came to my mind. I don't know if you have heard or seen it. Simon McBurney's Encounter, which we tried to analyze with the students in the third year when we study contemporary theater. So if you can give other examples or anything related to this, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, it's so. Yes, Simon McBurney's Encounter is certainly one of the works that I mention as being within this paradigm of works that I'm interested in, and that piece is particularly interesting because it also because McBurney himself comes from this Lecoq tradition of theater making, where physicality and the physical gesture was being emphasized for decades. And then suddenly in the year 2015, he made two works. One was The Encounter, which was the solo show he made. And another one was Beware of Pity, which was an ensemble piece he made in the Berlin Schaubühne, where he again also emphasized these sound making technologies as part of the process. And it seemed quite symptomatic that actually he had moved away from this interest in physical theater, because again, in the English speaking world, for years we had this term physical theater. You know, when I was a student, an undergraduate student, it was the thing that we all had to do, physical theater, because physical theater was seen as the main alternative to this sort of text-based tradition of British theater. And suddenly physical theater was the in thing. And for about 20 years or so, you know, physical theater was seen as being, you know, the most important new innovation in the theatrical landscape. But certainly over the last 20 years now, even those people who were doing physical theater, like Simon McBurney, like DV8 also made 3 verbatim pieces. They were still dance pieces, but they were dance pieces that used speech. And then, you know, I kind of put in this category also the work of Robert Lepage and his work Lip Sync, which came out in 2008. And it was a 9-hour piece about specifically speech, language, and speech, language, and voice. The differences between the three: voice, speech, and language, and how, you know, the nuances of those. And so, I mean, it was very interesting how actually this project evolved for me, because in the first instance, this interest started to emerge for me when I was finishing my PhD, and actually my PhD was on Yugoslav meta theater. And in the process of just writing a little bit of an introduction, at one point I wrote about the sort of oral traditions of in that part of the world, how actually our history of literature, if you like, uses this departure point of the oral literature as being quite important. And I came across, in the process of just writing up this little section, I came across some work that was conducted by some American ethnologists in the first half of the 20th century. So this is probably some of you might have come across them, Albert Lord and Milman Parry. They traveled to the Balkans in the 1930s, and they recorded some of those blind singers who were composing oral epics extemporaneously. They recorded them on some primitive sound devices, and they used this research in the 1930s to develop an argument that basically Homeric verse, so all of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, was actually composed using particular oral formulaic formulas that they identified by immersing themselves in this ethnographic work with these singers in the Balkans. They noticed the ways in which they composed these epics was dependent on certain formulas that they were using that repeated throughout, but that all of the work was basically improvisation. All of it was improvised, but they had certain patterns that they were using. And then they put an argument across that actually all of Homer was developed like this. And this argument was actually taken very seriously by the academic community at the time, and was quite influential on understanding other epics from other cultures and so on. But at the same time, as I was writing this bit of my PhD, I went to see the film 8 Mile by Eminem. I don't know whether you know this film. Eminem, rapper, American rapper, and he made a film called 8 Mile. And I was quite, suddenly there was this moment of resonance where I became aware of, because there was a moment of a rap battle in this film where two rappers have a mic, and then they are composing a rap number on the spot, and they are kind of in some sort of a competition with each other. And I suddenly became aware of how this is actually also very similar to what Milman Parry and Albert Lord were describing was taking place in those Balkan singers, that they were studying. So in a way, this process of oral composition, which has been there arguably since Homer, and probably has been there in all cultures in one way or another, came to the fore for me, and then I became interested in how it resonates with some contemporary forms. And I sort of wanted to look into this idea of oral composition in theater with regard to verbatim theater. And then I was talking somewhere about oral composition, and somebody misheard that as aural, because aural is also pronounced as oral. And then I decided to embrace that and to actually consider both oral and aural as part of this area of interest that my project is currently exploring, and that there is a very definite connection between the two in terms of the fact that those both oral and aural dramaturgies don't necessarily depart from the written, with the written as the point of departure, but something that is spoken or heard instead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if there is one more question, I think so. There is time for only one question. Or if nobody has questions, let me see. Then we thank you very much for
nekem volna egy kérdésem, elnézést.
Okay.
Ha lehet.
One more question, okay? Yes, János?
A kérdésem az ennek az...
Well, my question is, early this year, there is a sound-focused production, Szabolcs Hajdú and Töröki és Orsolya that set up a production based on the surveillance dossier of the Transylvanian actress Kinga Ilyich. So the production is based 90% on this. So actually, it is not my question. It is the question of Miklós Tamás Gáspár, who connected to this production, concludes his study by saying that the recorder was acting against of the will of the interviewee. So who is actually the author of this recording? And Miklós Tamás Gáspár says that the author is the Romanian Securitate, secret police. So actually, artistic work cannot be approached via snitches' depositions. What is your opinion about this?
So I'm not sure that I entirely understood the nuance of this question, because I don't have the knowledge of the background of the actual events that are at the core of this particular case. But I imagine that the question is around, so the way I hear the question, it's about authorship in a situation where there is a kind of a, if you like, a critical distance between the person collecting the testimony and the person whose testimony is being collected. Because what I heard was that the person who recorded the testimony did not represent the person of whose testimony was taken very faithfully. Is that did I understand it correctly? What was it?
Yes, you have it correctly.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think this is a very interesting take on, it's a very interesting example, yes, and it's a very interesting idea that an author might be historical circumstance or a factor that is outside of, directly the person, the people involved in this particular attempt to record history. And of course, it is, again, there we return to this sort of dialectical principle that I was trying to highlight at the beginning of my talk earlier about how really nothing is nothing just has one side. There is always the other side to everything. And what I'm really interested in this work, or kind of like trying to get the artist, involve the artist in the work of research and in the work of knowledge creation and knowledge production and so on. Of course, this is a very important perspective, that there will be difference of perspective, difference of that actually the researcher should certainly be allowed to reserve critical judgment. It's not about serving the artist. It's not about placing oneself in a kind of a subservient position. No, it's not about hierarchies or about power structures. It simply is, also about, I think history is important in this work as well. It is acknowledging the historical circumstance as also being always an important factor in the construction of knowledge, in the construction of an event, or what we then inherit as historical fact or historical data or historical circumstance. So I guess, the problem always is ego, isn't it? I mean, like, maybe what I should say that as part of this methodology, it really is also important to envisage a way of recording history at the end of the day, that takes the ego of the protagonists out of the equation, because it is this idea that the history has always been written by the winners, that we are in a way trying to contend with today and allow for the possibilities that there might have been other histories that have not been recorded, that are just as important in terms of understanding what might actually have taken place. So we absolutely have to stay vigilant in relation to what the context is and how these complexities might play out.
Okay, thank you. Then I think it's time to finish, and thank you very much again. I think this is the good occasion to applaud Duska Radosavljevic's lecture. I do it physically because I do not find the icon. And do not forget that tomorrow Christopher Balme will deliver a lecture at 12 o'clock. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, okay.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Eva, I'm sorry, I've just seen your message now about enlarging the Word document. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. It's just, it wasn't readable, but it was perfectly understandable. So.
Okay. Good. Thank you so much.
Okay, Duska, I want to ask you about the text where I wrote to you about it. So is it possible to publish it by our periodic, or is it something else?
Yes. Well, I'm sort of. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I'm sort of still writing this as part of what should be a new book. It's going a bit slowly, a bit more slowly than I expected, because of COVID and so on. I mean, I in principle, I don't have anything against publishing a section from it before the book is out, but what do you think would be the time frame? I think it might be good for me to just understand.
Beginning at the beginning of next year.
Okay, already.
So it's in January, I think so.
Okay, well, I mean,
we'll discuss it in.
Yes, let's talk on email a bit more about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And
thank you. Was it okay for Judith to translate?
It was fine for the translator too, but we'll ask her. Is she gone? Yeah.
Yeah, she left.
Already.
Yes, it was okay and understandable.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Let's keep in touch.
Yes, definitely. I would like to hear Chris's talk as well, maybe.
Okay.
tomorrow.
Yeah, one more question. Are we allowed to put this video on the video channel of the CUB, of the organizer?
Yeah, I'm fine. Well, would you be able to send it to me as well?
Okay, is it possible, Zsuzsa?
Yes, we will try.
Great.
Do you want to send me?
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
sending you now the link, okay, for tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks. Thank
Maybe
you.
you need to save it because it will.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so let me save everything.
12 Romanian time, so it means, so it's not London
2
time.
hours. Yes.
Yeah,
Then I can't save.
at 10 o'clock as you is your discussion, your lecture.
Yes. Great. Okay. Oh, I can't save this for some reason. It's not
But
letting me.
you find it in the event I sent to you.
Okay.
The Facebook event.
Excellent.
Those links were there.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.